With me, I have Peter, and he's going to talk about pushing eHealth interoperability in Germany. So, well, Peter, if you are ready, please go ahead.
I am. Thank you very much. I guess in the talk before we saw a little bit about architectures and how it's been done in Austria. What I'm going to do is I like to show you how we actually tackle interoperability. So I'm not talking about architecture, I'm talking about the initiatives and the possibilities that we actually do in order to cope with interoperability issues and interoperability in general, based on everything that we have around in Germany. But first, I think I have to introduce myself. So you see that I'm Peter. I call myself Interoperability Partner Manager. I'm doing that since the last year now. I'm working for the Gematik, and in the Gematik we have, let's say, an institution or an entity which we refer to as the National Coordination Center for Interoperability. Sounds tedious, is quite cool, to be honest. From my background, as you can see, I was a developer beforehand, and by the number of stickers on my laptop lid, you can tell that I'm no longer a developer. So I went on to being an architect, so I was on the technical part and then switched roles to the product side. So I was a product owner and product manager as well, and finally ended up as being an interoperability partner manager these days. Yeah, so before we begin, before I tell you on how we actually cope with all interoperability, with all the issues that we have, let me show you some kind of preconditioning that we have in the German landscape, in the eHealth landscape or healthcare landscape in general. So what you see in here is more or less an overview about players that we have in Germany, right? And which is quite more interesting are those figures that you see on the right side. You see that we're talking about roughly 83 million insured persons in Germany. We're talking about 1,900 hospitals, and we're talking about 110 doctors' offices, and all been done by roughly 360,000 doctors in Germany, which means there's quite some chances to create data silos. And let me tell you that those chances have been taken. So I think I'm not telling you something new, right? If you see, especially in the hospital landscape, coming from an historical perspective, there were chances that have been taken to assemble data, to assemble information, and then create so-called data silos on its own. And now it's up to us to actually break this open and bring their interoperability into the world so that we can make use of the data in a not remote, but actually in a central way. I think few of you saw the talk by Julian this morning. He was talking about the medical informatics initiative, and there's something that has been residing on interoperability as well, for sure. Otherwise, you can't make use of the data. Besides the situation that we have in Germany, we're also talking about the EU perspective, and I think I'm not telling you something new in here, but you see that there are actually 4 pillars which are interesting and need to be considered. So obviously you have the patient that you see on the left side, which need to have control over their own data, which assemble their own data. Then you have the healthcare professionals, which obviously create data as well and information that need to be taken into consideration. But you also have the stakeholders in terms of the right side, especially for researching or on the regulation level as well. And they all have to make use of the data that's being assembled. They have to make use of data that's been created by those entities I mentioned beforehand, but also being created by devices on its own, by apps which are growing these days, right? And all in all, this is going into the play of creating a better care and creating a possibility for better health research. What I want to show you in here is kind of a layer or a field of topics and all those stakeholders that take a crucial role in interoperability in Germany in general. And we had a short discussion about that beforehand, why there isn't a central institution taking care of or making HL7 a way stronger part than it seems as it is right now. And I think looking at this picture and seeing the different players being in here, and keep in mind this is just a selection of players, that's more or less the big ones that you can see in here. It's not the entirety of everyone actually having a stake in interoperability, but it's giving you a feeling on who you have to cope with, how you have to handle situations when there are problems arising, right? And which is quite new, and you see that on the lower part in here, and being situated right in the middle of everything. So in the middle of semantic, syntactic, and organizational interoperability is actually the two entities which we refer to as the Interop Council, as well as the National Coordination Center for Interoperability that I'm working for. And the idea of these two entities is actually to have someone who is building a bracket around everything, who's sitting on top of that, who is coordinating actually what's been going on, how has it been done, is there a demand, is there a need for harmonization, etc., etc. Again, this is giving you an overview, and I think if you followed closely the presentations beforehand, you might recall some of those abbreviations that have been mentioned before. Okay, so how do we actually steer interoperability? Well, first and foremost, what we did is we kind of came up with a vision, and you see that here. That's kind of our way, our methodology in order to approach interoperability in general. So first and foremost, you can see that we identified 3 visions that we need to take care of. Then we went one part lower. We said, okay, let's identify the playing fields that we have to cope in. And what you see here is this is kind of resembling to the layers of interoperability, right? You see regulatory, organizational, semantic, and technical level. And then we came to the conclusion that we have to have a mission, or we have to have several missions. And you see those 4 mission statements in here. And then eventually drilled down to the part of where do we have actionable doings to be done, right? So you see those in those action fields, and we can refer to that at a later point in time as well, because this is actually bringing us the argumentation for coming up with a roadmap on tackling different fields of interoperability. As you can imagine, it's quite a vast topics that can be addressed in here, and you need to have a possibility to cope with it, to prioritize, and therefore come up with a roadmap. And we do that not on our own, as I said beforehand. We do that together with what we call the Interop Council, and everything that's been written down here can be seen as part of something that we call the interoperability governance in Germany. So this governance is consisting of 3 pillars at the end of the day. It's on the one hand, it's the Interop Council, as you can see over there. 7 heads, 7 experts, which represent the stakeholder groups you see being outlined over there. Those are well-established experts, and I think some faces will be familiar for you as well, even some of them in the room in here. And this Interop Council is working together with a pool of experts, as you can see down there. That's the second pillar, actually. We have a pool of experts from the German landscape, but internationally as well, currently consisting of 180 experts, roughly 180 experts, steadily growing, and this is quite amazing. Again, also the experts that we have in this pool are in one of those buckets that you can put down there with the stakeholder groups. And the idea of those 7 stakeholder groups that have been mentioned in here, if you take a close look at it, is to bring the possibility, and this is kind of the mission that the Interop Council itself created, bring the possibility to have an end-to-end perspective. Whenever you tackle interoperability, it's quite clear that it's not only a technical part that needs to be addressed. You're not only talking about interfaces, you're not talking about data exchange possibilities, you're talking about semantic and syntactic interoperability, you're talking about organizational interoperability, and then it's quite clear that you have to have the possibility to analyze status quo, to analyze situations on an end-to-end basis along the lines of journeys, which we call patient journeys, as well as professional journeys, but also on processes, right? So we are also taking into consideration, for example, the medication process, right? This is something which will be resembled in the near future. where we actually take a look at the very first beginning of the treatment, and then you check on the various actors that being involved in medication, and then coming up to having a healthy patient at the end of the day. So again, having the possibility to look at situations end to end. What in all these parts, oh, by the way, the third pillar is the National Coordination Office that I'm working with, so referring to the number 3. But crucial things in here is when we have those experts and we have the Interop Council, obviously they need to do something, right? We are organizing work in working groups, and those working groups are more or less seen or being created on an agile perspective. So we're saying that a working group should not be consisting of more than 10 members. So that makes it possible to actually go on a dedicated time frame in order to work on certain topics. A part of those working groups, by the way, they're working on recommendations at the end of the day, recommendations being given to the different stakeholders that you saw beforehand. But what we're also doing in here is, especially the Interop Council, is create an overview about recommendations of standards, right? So if you're talking about fire, this is something which I think is quite amazing being done last year, is that the Interop Council in one of the public meetings announced the jumpstart of fire in Germany, which actually means that if you take a close look of this, and you can follow that on the webpage, by the way, I mentioned down here, we have a catalog of criteria being assembled in order to actually recommend standards, so that we are not just blankly handing out, this is a standard, hey, use it, but following a structured approach where we say, okay, there's a catalog of criteria, and one criteria in this catalog, and this is why it's resembling to the jumpstart for fire, is saying that whenever there's being a new standard created which is dealing with data communication, it has to be based on fire. And this is actually quite a good push in Germany, and something which I brag about quite often because I find it rather amazing. Yeah, and then at the end of the day, in order to make that mandatory, we have the possibility to recommend those standards that we recommended beforehand, recommend that to the Ministry of Health, and then eventually bring it onto a mandatory level for all the actors, for all the players in this field. What you see here, and this is my last slide, this is what I was referring to beforehand. We created some kind of roadmap together with the Interop Council. And along the lines of those roadmaps, you see various topics being in here, which will be tackled currently until the end of 2024. It's quite small in here, but believe me, it's saying 2024. And this is varying in terms of working groups as well, but also in terms of topics that need to be analyzed, addressed, and in generally being tackled. Some quite cool things in here, and I referred to your talk beforehand. We also dealt with terminology services, so made some kind of recommendation on how to deal with a terminology service in Germany on a national scale. This is something which is driving interoperability in Germany quite forward. Also talking about a validator, right? A reference validator that has been or that shall be used by everyone who's actually creating standards in Germany. Yeah, this is actually my last slide. Again, this is my contact information. I want to reach out to me. I also want to highlight this one over here. So if you think that it was a quite okay talk, give me the feedback. I appreciate that. Apart from that, I'm open to questions right now.
Thank you, Peter. No online questions as of yet, so we'll just see in the room. And of course, we have our Finnish friend here. So.
Of course, you will have a question from Mikael. So Mikael Rinnetmäki, Sensor Trend. And I noticed on your last slide the diabetes diary app, and I heard Nick also talk about the diabetes app. We, Sensor Trend, do diabetes remote monitoring and diabetes care plans. So my question actually to both of you is, will you start developing these kind of services from scratch, or are you open to adopting readily available solutions?
You have to keep one thing in mind. The level I'm talking about is not going into a product direction. So we are not developing something, especially in in the terms of the Interop Council or in the terms of the National Coordination Office, but we're given recommendations. At the end of the day, you have on a layer below that, you have the industry, and then it's up to the industry to come up with solutions. So we're not giving you the advice to create something new or to rely on something that's been out there. But if it's been standardized or it's been standards-based, then we for sure give the recommendation to go with those standards. If you build it from scratch, totally on your own.
So if you go back to your slide, there was this citizen's journey diabetes diary is almost in the bottom right. Is the meaning that you'll standardize that in some way, the features, or can you talk more about what's the idea behind that?
You're below here, right?
Exactly.
On this part, yeah. Well, again, this is topics that need to be addressed, and what we do when we identify those topics, we deep dive into that and check where are interoperability issues. How is the status quo being done right now? How should it be in the ideal way? And this is what we do in here. So identifying issues in terms of data standards, in terms of organizational parts, in terms of regulations, etc., and then come up with recommendations. And those recommendations eventually are being handed over to, as I said before, and either industry partners or regulators, or even there can even be a recommendation for creating a new standard as well, right? We're open for that as well.
Yeah, let's definitely talk more about that.
Sure.
My insight is that there needs to be an ecosystem of many different apps because people with diabetes have vastly different needs and also goals, and people react differently to different kind of inputs. So attempt to create a fruitful and flourishing marketplace for different apps there. And congrats with all you do with Digas in Germany and all of that. So thanks.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I understand this picture correctly, but it looks like kind of a waterfall model where one thing goes after the other. Is there any other interconnection here? And I think maybe it says that the one color is the actual cooperation phase between care providers, and I suppose you could look into how cooperation should work and have a lot of people working together on a lot of these different phases in your process. Can you comment on that? How it's going to work?
Sure, good question. It looks waterfally, I guess, right? But it's not. I mean, at the end of the day, what we need to do is we have to have some kind of iterative process in order to cope with the different topics, in order to cope with different ideas as well as problems. And this is kind of resembling in this roadmap in here. So we specifically did not do it like the normal waterfall process where you have those columns and then you put it down, right, and then you have your achievement at a certain point in time, but rather go with this snaky way, as I would say. But again, this is more or less for illustrating that we have an iterative approach in here. We cannot do everything at once. That's kind of a German approach, which is not really the way we should go, right? But we learned our lesson and we said, okay, we need to deal one by one with the certain different aspects in here. And then you're right. It's also about communicating with all the parties that I showed you before in this quite extensive picture, to involve those parties in the working group at the end of the day, which is, on another note, quite challenging too, because when we give ourselves the regulation to say that the working group shall not be bigger with more than 10 participants, it's quite a challenge to involve everyone. But for not only for transparency purposes, but also to address the issue, what we do is that all the meetings when this working group is coming together are publicly available. So everyone from outside, even you, if you want to, you can join those meetings, you can follow the discussions, and you can even bring your ideas and your perspectives into the play as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We're almost out of time, so if you have any more remaining questions, just ask Peter. And Nick, of course, is also available. I think there will be a lot of nice discussions going on after these two talks. So thank you, Peter, as well for this talk.
Thank you very much.